Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I am Trevor, the Communications Manager for the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, which continues our 2024 webinar series. If you're new to our webinars, a little background on our group. CCSN works to connect patients, survivors, and other stakeholder groups with decision makers and the wider community to engage in discussion and to act on evidence-based best practices to alleviate the medical, emotional, financial, and social costs of cancer. To learn more, visit survivornet.ca. Now, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, and a link will be provided by the email you registered with, along with a link to the slides provided with this presentation. We will add a quick Q&A session at the end, but if you'd like, put your questions in the questions tab on the GoToWebinar screen. It should be on the tabs on your right. Now, to introduce our presenters, we have two today. Chad Lever is Director of Health, is the Director of the Health Knowledge Area, and leads Value-Based Healthcare Canada with roots in behavioral epidemiology and health services policy and research. Chad oversees multi-stakeholder, custom, and priority research initiatives. Prior to joining the Conference Board of Canada, Chad held multiple senior roles in applied research at Seneca College, Canada Health Infoway, and the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences. Chad holds an MSc in Community Health and Epidemiology from Dalhousie University and an MBA from Queen's and Cornell Universities. Also is Sophia Garcia, a senior health economist and economic research. She is an interdisciplinary researcher with training in health economics, health policy, health equity, and population health. At the Conference Board of Canada, Sophia is involved in all stages of the research process, from study design to data management, statistical analysis, and report writing. Prior to joining the board, Sophia completed her embedded postdoctoral fellowship with the University of Toronto and the Central West Ontario Health Team. Sophia holds a PhD in health policy with a specialization in health economics from McMaster University and a Master of Public Health degree from University of Guelph. And without further ado, I will hand it over to both of them for their webinar, Access and Time to Patient Prescription Drugs in Canada.
Trevor, thank you very much for that great introduction, and it's our honor and pleasure to be here with you today to share the results of this analysis. For today's presentation, I'll provide an overview of time to patient drug listing process in Canada, and Sophia will present the analysis of our drug listing time by stage in the drug listing process, by province and by time, with some great summative comments, and looking forward to any comments and questions you may have following our presentation. A little bit about the Conference Board of Canada. I won't read through this slide, but it's really exciting to note that we are now in our 70th anniversary. Since 1954, we have helped to guide decision makers with our unique approach and focus to evidence-based insights. I invite you to visit our website for our foremost research outputs that happen every day. We are producing, as our impact report from last year shows, 369 research outputs overall, many of which are in our economic area, 104 research reports out of our economic research department, to which Sophia is located. That's 28%. And we have 9 knowledge areas, from human capital, innovation, sustainability, education and skills, health, immigration, indigenous and northern communities, and economic research. Please visit our website, become a subscriber to learn more about our research. We also engage very much with our research by those who visit our site. We had close to 2 million page views last year, 33,000 downloads of our research reports, and very high impressions with respect to 6.2 million impressions in our social research impact. So do connect with us on LinkedIn and Facebook. What makes our research really come alive is the connections we have through the 994 meetings with external stakeholders, decision makers at 370, and 624 meetings with influencers, to which this webinar counts today. It's really about having our research impact decision makers and influencers like yourselves to create change based on evidence that we generate. So for today's presentation, patient access to pharmaceuticals in Canada, some high point information that on average, Canadians wait 2 years for access to new medicines through public drug plans following drug approval from Health Canada. And that's double the average time reported by several other high-income OECD countries. And our analysis validates and reflects this that we'll show today. Approval in Canada can take actually up to 6 years longer than in the United States or Europe for rare disorder drugs. And this is a really important component of the analysis we'll present today, especially for 1 in 12 Canadians who live with a rare disorder. They play an essential role in the treatment of cancer, absolutely, and it's important that patients receive the right drug at the right time, but several barriers across Canada are faced. The recommended drug is not covered by provincial plans, or the drug is in the process of being reviewed through the drug approval process and is taking far too long. I'll turn it over to Sophia to cover the regulatory pathway of medicines in Canada and to review the results of our analysis. Sophia.
Thanks, Chad. So in our research project with IMC, we examined the time it takes for drugs to become publicly available to patients with breakdowns by year, step in the process, and province. And it's important to know the timing of drugs at these various stages in the process to be able to understand where exactly the delays exist, how listing times evolve over years as policies are implemented, and to identify opportunities for improvement to ensure patients have timely access to therapies. So I'll just walk you through the steps that are involved in getting a drug after it's manufactured to public drug plans very briefly. So after the drug has been created by the manufacturer, it's first submitted to Health Canada. The Therapeutic Products Branch of Health Canada tests the drug, and it's called the new active substance at this time, through multiple clinical phases to ensure that it is safe and effective. Health Canada offers priority regulatory processes, but unlike other countries such as England and Wales, France, Germany, Italy, and Australia, we don't have a formalized early access program that allows patients to start using the drugs before this entire review process is completed. The next step, so after it's deemed to be effective and safe, a notice of compliance is issued for that drug. And at this point, companies can market their product and it can be listed in private insurance plans. But if the pharmaceutical company wants the drug to be covered in public insurance plans, then several other critical steps in the process follow. And our analysis focuses on these steps. So after the new active substance receives the notice of compliance, the pharmaceutical company has to file an application with CADTH, or the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies, if they want the drug to be covered in public plans. And CADTH is a government-funded health technology assessment agency for public insurance coverage assessment. In Quebec, the equivalent is INIS. And what these groups do is they conduct clinical and cost effectiveness assessments. And then they recommend whether this drug should be reimbursed by provincial and territorial plans. So following that recommendation, then the drug plans start to negotiate with the manufacturer through the PCPA, or the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And they start negotiating on prices and other coverage terms. And these negotiations then become the basis for formal product listing agreements with provinces, territories, and federal plans. So once this process is completed, then the drug can be listed on public drug plans. So next slide, please. In our report, which is titled Access and Time to Patient Prescription Drugs in Canada, we analyzed the average time it took for drugs to be listed in provincial public drug plans following drug approval or PCPA negotiation. And we interpret this time as time to patient. For our analysis, we use data from IQVIA, Market Access Metrics database from the years 2012 to 2023. We had access to data on all drugs that had been reimbursed at this time and how much time did it spend. We knew how much time it spent on different phases of the process that we just outlined. So going to our analysis now, and what we found. So here on this first graph, we're showing the overall time to listing. In the y-axis, we have the years. On the x-axis, we have the number of days. And the different rows are for the different years. And the different shades we're showing are the different phases. So starting from the left, that royal blue color shows the time it took for going from notice of compliance to CADTH submission. Then we move to the right, and the next phase is the CADTH duration. Continuing on, then it's the CADTH to the PCPA initiation phase. Then how much time did it spend in the PCPA negotiation? Then how much time did it take from that PCPA completion? So after it's been negotiated to the first listing. So to the first listing in whatever province, and then to 50% listing. So that's when 50% of the provinces and territories have listed it. So first, comparing the total time across the years, it took 599 days for drugs to be listed in 2020. This increased to 901 days in 2021, and then to 826 days in 2022. So just a little over 2 years. And now breaking it down by phase, so in focusing on 2022, the phase of submitting to CADTH after a notice of compliance has been issued took 109 days. Then it took 246 days for CADTH or INIS to review and do assessments. After the recommendation, it took 172 days to initiate the PCPA negotiation, then 186 days to do the negotiation, and after the negotiation is completed, it took on average 19 days for the drug to be listed on the first provincial drug plan. And then after that, finally, 90 days for it to be listed on 50% of other provincial territorial drug plans. So from this, you can clearly see where the bottlenecks are in the CADTH process and the PCPA negotiation phase. The negotiation phase takes several months, in particular because pharmaceutical companies, there are a lot of complex negotiations involved. There's a need to do data analysis, legal and regulatory considerations that need to be looked at, administrative processes, stakeholder input, and the strategic factors that are involved that influence the discussions. So the 172 days that we see in 2022 for that initiation, for the CADTH to PCPA negotiation, we can compare that to the recommended target. So it's recommended that this phase takes 60 days by the PCPA brand process guidelines. So you can clearly see that we are way beyond that in 2022. Then next, we see that it took 189 days during the negotiation. That's also much higher than the recommended time frame of 120 calendar days or 90 business days. And then if we were to do the analysis comparing across the years, we can see that we're quicker at listing in the first plan now. So it took us 99 days for it to be listed on the first province after PCPA being negotiated in 2020, and that decreased to 19 days in 2022. So we see an improvement there. But you will see in the subsequent slides that this is not the case for all provinces. This is the average for the first listing, and it includes provinces that are doing really well in terms of listing dates, such as Quebec, which you will see in the subsequent slides. Next, we see that we've increased time significantly through initiating PCPA negotiation after the CADTH submission. So it went from 75 days in 2020 to 172 days in 2022. Lastly, we see the negative value in 2020 for submitting it to CADTH, and that's because in 2012, we had implemented a policy, part of the Health Canada Health Technology Assessment Aligned Review process, that said that you were able to submit it to CADTH before getting Health Canada approval. But we can see in the subsequent years, this policy was not implemented in all years. Next slide, please. So now here, what we're showing is the provincial variation in the amount of time it takes to reimbursement after PCPA negotiation, or what we call time to patient. So we have provinces now on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis we have the number of days it took for the dark blue navy bars to become publicly available. And then we're also showing the number of drugs in that royal blue color. So for Quebec, how we would interpret it, so that first province is that it took an average of 44 days for 37 drugs to be listed in Quebec following PCPA negotiation. So what we can see clearly is that the average time to patient in 2022, once PCPA negotiation was completed, it varied significantly. It was the shortest in Quebec at 1.5 months, and the longest in PEI at 22 months or 662 days. It appeared that the eastern provinces took longer to list relative to other provinces. And then we see that BC took 168 days. Ontario, a comparable province in terms of size, took 168 days. And then we see that Alberta took longer. Also would like to highlight that this listing time doesn't always have to do with the number of drugs being listed. For example, when comparing Prince Edward Island and Manitoba, we see that they had 44 and 46 drugs listed respectively, but the time to patient in Prince Edward Island was more than 3 times longer. On the next slide, what we're showing is the average time to patient across provinces across time. Again, we're showing on the x-axis the average days for the drugs to be reimbursed following PCPA negotiation, and then in the royal blue we have the number of drugs, and we've broken it down by province. So starting with BC on your top left, we can see that in 2022 there was a decrease in the number of days to become publicly available. So from 249 days in 2020 to 168 days in 2022. So we saw an improvement of 81 days or 2.7 months. Then for Quebec, we see that Quebec is doing the best. So in 2020, it took an average of 120 days for drugs to be listed. And that became quicker in 2021 to 114 days, and then to 44 days in 2022. So we see that Quebec was doing well, and then it improved even further. So there was an improvement of 76 days or 2.5 months. Then moving to the right on Ontario, we don't see a huge difference across time. So in 2020 to 2022, we see that there was a 10-day improvement. We do see that more drugs are being listed, but this possibly could be because of a backlog from the year prior, where we had fewer drugs being listed and shorter amount of time. In Alberta, we see an opposite trend when we compare to other provinces. So we see a decline in the time it's taking for drugs to become reimbursed. So we see a decrease of 103 days or 3.4 months when we compare 2020 to 2022. So it's taking Alberta a longer time to have drugs be reimbursed compared to the years prior. Then on the next slide, we're showing similar graphs, but for Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So for Manitoba, we saw that there's a slight improvement, so 7 days. And then for Saskatchewan, we see that there's a 62-day improvement over time, comparing 2020 to 2022. Then moving on to the eastern side of the country, so we see for Newfoundland that there is an improvement of 4 days. And then when we look at PI, we see that there is a large improvement. So we see an improvement of 579 days or 19.3 months. And this is the largest improvement that we see when we compare it to other provinces, but that could be because in 2020, it took 1,241 days for drugs to reimburse. So that's a long delay. So it must be that in the recent years, they're trying to clear that backlog that occurred in 2020. So in Nova Scotia, moving along, we see that there's a 10-day improvement, 10-day increase in the listing time. And in New Brunswick, we also see a 4-day increase. So overall, we see that the wait time is longer in eastern provinces and that there hasn't been much improvement when we compare to other provinces, but there also hasn't been a huge decline, which we saw in Alberta in the slide before. Here on this next slide, we're showing now the average days to reimbursement following PCPA negotiation for oncology drugs compared to non-oncology drugs across provinces. So it's a similar type of analysis, but we're comparing oncology versus non-oncology drugs. And in this table, we are going from British Columbia over to our west, if you go down the table to Newfoundland. So for British Columbia, we see that it took 119 days for drugs to be listed following negotiations, and for 235 days for non-oncology drugs. And the number in bold just indicates which type of drug took longer. So for British Columbia, non-oncology drugs took longer in the year 2022. So overall, we find that it took oncology drugs slightly longer to be listed than non-oncology drugs on average. So it took 279 days for oncology drugs and 222 days for non-oncology drugs. Oncology drugs took longest. If we were to look at the first column, they took the longest in Prince Edward Island, so it took 654 days. Then in Newfoundland, we saw that it took 396 days, followed by Alberta with 369 days. And then for non-oncology drugs, so if we were to go to the next column to the right, drugs took the longest in Prince Edward Islands, so with 670 days, followed by Nova Scotia at 373 days, Newfoundland 308 days, and then British Columbia at 235 days. When we compare oncology to non-oncology across provinces, we see that oncology drugs took longer in 6 provinces than non-oncology drugs. In terms of the difference that we see between the types of drugs being listed, so that's what's reflected in that third column, we see that it was the largest in Alberta. So the difference between oncology drug listing and non-oncology drug listing on average was 224 days. And then we see that large difference also in New Brunswick, where the difference was 206 days. And then next was Ontario, where the difference was 144 days. Next slide, please. So on this slide here, now we're showing the change in listing time from 2020 to 2022. So again, we have the oncology drugs on the left and the non-oncology drugs on the right. And we're showing the change in the average days to reimbursement. In the red is where we had a decline, and then the blue we have where there was an improvement. So going through it, so we can see for oncology drugs, we see for in terms of where there was a decline, we see that Alberta had a large decline where it took in 2022 176 days longer for drugs to be listed compared to 2020. Then for New Brunswick, we see that listing time increased by 142 days. And for Newfoundland, 123 days, and Manitoba, 84 days. The increase was smaller in Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan. So in Saskatchewan, it was 3 days, and Nova Scotia, 40 days. And if we look at where there was improvement, so that's the cells that are in blue, it is the provinces that, so the improvement is that we saw there to be fewer days for listing compared to 2020 in 2022. So we see that in Ontario, it was 54 days improvement, Quebec, 73-day improvement, British Columbia, 14-day improvement. The largest improvement was in Prince Edward Island, and this aligns with what we showed in the previous graph, where 2022 drugs were being listed faster, and we see that in the case of oncology too for Prince Edward Island. But this could be because they had this large delay in 2020, so there may be just clearing that backlog. And then moving to the next column for non-oncology drugs, we see that there was much more improvement in non-oncology drugs in terms of listing time. So we see an improvement of 145 days in British Columbia in 2022 compared to 2020. In Saskatchewan for 141 days improvement, and we see an improvement in other provinces as well. We see a decline in Alberta and in Prince Edward Island. So in Alberta, we have seen that overall they have been taking longer amount of time to list, and most of that comes from oncology. So there's a decline of 176 days over time compared to non-oncology drugs, where there was a decline of 10 days. So most of that decrease, we could say, is being driven by oncology drugs. And then for Prince Edward Island, we see that there's an improvement in oncology drugs, but there's a decline in non-oncology drugs. So you can see that there is a prioritization, you can say, of oncology drugs that's occurring in Prince Edward Island. Next slide. So this last slide for our analysis shows what we did, where we looked at 70 drugs that concluded PCPA negotiation between 2022 and 2023 in our data set. And we looked at, for these 70 drugs, which provinces were they listed in. So how you interpret this table is, of those 70 drugs, 44% were listed in British Columbia, 51% Alberta, 51% Saskatchewan, and so on. So clearly we can see that there's provincial variation in listing. So the percent of drugs listed is the lowest in Prince Edward Island. So only 20% of the 70 drugs are being listed in PI, and it's the highest in Quebec with 61%. There's significant access gaps in Atlantic provinces, so at the bottom half of the table, where we see that New Brunswick listed only 30% of the drugs, Nova Scotia listed 33%, and Newfoundland 26%. And then for the other provinces, we see that range from 44% BC to 59% in Ontario. So overall, we see that the access is different depending on which province you're from. And even for provinces that are doing well, such as Quebec and Ontario, we see that we don't have 100% listing, where drugs are not accessible same manner across the country, where some drugs are accessible in some provinces and not in others. So now I will turn it over to Chad to summarize what we just discussed through our analysis.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you for that really detailed review of the analysis. Really appreciate that. So in summary, the time between regulatory approval for new drugs and their listing on public provincial formularies averaged 25 months in 2022. That's double the average time reported from OECD countries. The overall time to patient in 2022 varied by province, as Sophia outlined, largely driven by delays surrounding completion of the individual provincial product listing agreements. Example of that is the 44 days in Quebec and the 622 in PEI, 662 in PEI, and 168 in BC after the PCPA negotiation. So the performance, average time to reimbursement over the last 10 years, British Columbia patients waited approximately 5.5 months, the same amount of time as Ontario patients to have a reimbursement decision from PCPA negotiation process. Quebec patients waited the least for reimbursement decisions at just over 1 month, 1.4, followed by Saskatchewan patients who waited just over 3 months. Patients in Manitoba waited half a year, 6.2 months, and Alberta patients waited up to 9 months. For cancer specifically, oncology drugs have longer listing times. Took oncology drugs slightly longer to be listed than non-oncology drugs on average, 279 versus 222 days. Oncology drugs took longer in 6 provinces than non-oncology drugs, with the longest difference in Alberta and New Brunswick, where it took oncology drugs 7.5 months to be listed. Oncology drugs took the longest in PEI, Newfoundland, and Alberta, as Sophia outlined quite explicitly in our analysis. But let's look at learning health systems since 2020. Quebec has report, from these data has the shortest listing time in each year compared to the other provinces. And since 2020, it improved further by 76 days or 2.5 months. On the other hand, Alberta's average time to reimbursement increased or it worsened. So Alberta's average time to reimbursement worsened by 3.4 months. The average time to reimbursement decisions on new medicines decreased or it improved. So the average time to reimbursement decisions on new medicines improved in the following provinces: BC by 2.5 months, Saskatchewan by 2, PEI by close to 20 months, and they made up a lot of gains there. Manitoba really in days, and Newfoundland also in days. The average time to reimbursement decisions on new medicines increased in the following provinces. In Ontario, that was just by days, as well as New Brunswick 4 days, and Nova Scotia about 10 days. And finally, learning systems since 2020 continued. There's been an improvement in time to patient for both oncology and non-oncology drugs in Canada. But oncology drugs have had the most substantive, non-oncology drugs have had the most substantive improvement of 145 days on average versus 14 days for oncology drugs. For non-oncology drugs, we do observe a worsening in time to patient and PI in Alberta, while for all other provinces there was an improvement observed. For oncology drugs, we saw a worsening in time to patient in 6 provinces, ranging from 176 days in Alberta to 3 days in Saskatchewan. And we observed an improvement in time to patient in Canada's larger provinces and PEI, perhaps, as Sophia has outlined, due to the prioritization of clearing the backlog. Overall, long wait times for pharmaceuticals. Time to patient, in our definition, it's important for us to note that it doesn't encapsulate the clinical and administrative implementation time following the reimbursement listing. So following this process and these days, there's a lot that needs to happen at the clinic level for the implementation of these therapies. And that in itself can take a substantive amount of time before patient administration. There's even a longer wait time for pharmaceuticals if the delays after the drug is reimbursed are considered. Of course, we're happy to take further questions, and of course, questions now.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. And for all those of you who are asking, yes, we will be sharing these slides with you too, so you can go over the details of this. Now, I understand that this is very much, you're looking at the data and everything, but if you could extrapolate a little bit more on maybe some other things that you've been able to conclude because of this study. I think a lot of people are wondering, for instance, like, why Quebec and how are they so quick in comparison to other provinces? Because it seems like that Quebec is, even in larger provinces like BC and Ontario, Quebec seems to be head over heels quicker in improving these drugs than others. And I was wondering if either of you could speak as to why that is.
Personally, I'll start, Sophia. I don't know if you have thoughts on this. I do know Quebec is quite well organized and has really shown themselves to be ahead in health policy with this regard. I don't know if there's a process step there, Trevor, that is really making Quebec, stand out among the pack. I think what's really interesting about the analysis we conducted is if we look at Team Canada, that these data should be very telling to Team Canada at large. And what can the other provinces learn from Quebec, I think is really the next step in this analysis. That Quebec being so ahead of the pack, it's not about competition, but it is about a learning healthcare system. And I would like to see actually other provinces learn from how Quebec has really managed to be so successful in the process steps that we've outlined today. Sophia, did you have some thoughts there?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, Quebec has a few processes that are different. They have INIS as opposed to CADIF that the rest of the provinces follow. Quebec also is different in terms of their insurance and for pharmaceuticals. So they do differ compared to other provinces in some of the steps that exist. But like Chad said, that is something that needs to be learned. Like, what is Quebec doing well that can be followed by other provinces?
Sean asked, in the provinces, which government department is accountable for the time to list? Are we aware if they have a scorecard?
So to my knowledge, it would be the health ministries in each province. And no, I don't believe that there is a scorecard on this process. And actually meeting to Sophia's outline earlier in the presentation on the target days. Are you aware of a scorecard, Sophia?
No,
No.
not that I've seen.
Yeah. So there are targets, as Sophia outlined in one of those first slides, and the variation to that target, which would be really good information for a scorecard for ministries of health to be able to benchmark to.
Mm-hmm. And as Francis has pointed out, INES is better structured, better organized, and has a more transparent process. They also have more people dedicated to the entire process. And kind of a question that I have that will springboard on that, thank you for your comment, Francis, is this why potentially PEI has such a long wait time that just the resources might not be there for them to be as effective as the other provinces?
Yeah, I would argue so.
Yeah. Sorry, Sophia. Yeah, I would suspect that's a really good observation. Transparency, like these data and like this analysis, which is no small feat to attain these data and to have the permissions to present these analyses. No small feat. So transparency can do a great deal, and of course, having experts, accountable to produce these analyses and to hold accountability to decision makers is critically important to really advance progress.
Yeah. And we also have to remember the timing of the data set. So it was 2020 to 2022. So in the pandemic, 2020 data. So that could be possibly why there's that huge backlog in PEI. They just didn't have the resources to push these drugs forward. They may have been at capacity, as other provinces were too, but given their size, it may be more difficult.
If anyone else has any more questions, please feel free to go to the questions tab on GoToWebinar. A question for both of you guys. Is there anything that you guys are working on currently in your work and research that you're able to talk about that you think might be of interest to our network? Because again, this is fantastic presentations, but we're sometimes wondering, what are you working on next? What's next for you guys?
Well, Sophia, maybe I'll let you talk about our project Shock, Surge, and Solutions.
Sure. So we're doing a study with different blood cancers where we're looking at the economic impact of making different drugs for blood cancers more available. So if we increase the access to these breakthrough, these big drugs in blood cancers, what economic impact would that have in the future? So we measure that economic impact by productivity. So if patients were given these highly effective breakthrough drugs, how many years do they live longer? What does that mean in terms of their productivity and being able to contribute back to the economy? So we're doing the study for Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, and looking at the drugs that are we talk to clinicians, and we're looking at drugs that are being prescribed to patients, and we're saying that if these drugs, were more readily accessible, what does this mean for the patients and as well to the economy?
Mm-hmm. I want to highlight too some research that Sophia just finished in the context of heart valve disease and valuing healthy aging and what the contributions to society and the economy are for citizens over 65 when they are living healthier in terms of volunteering and caregiving. We've also got work in our Value-Based Healthcare Canada Research Centre on the role of patient-reported outcomes in Canadian health systems. We have case studies planned across various therapeutic areas, including cancer, where patient-reported outcomes are being applied in Canada. And the idea is that to illustrate the value of the administration of patient-reported outcomes, where patients are completing these outcomes tools across their care journey and what it means for them to get access to care because they've been completing these tools that are interfacing with clinical teams that see that they may or may not be doing well on certain treatments, and they're bringing them in for follow-up sooner. So this is a really exciting program of research we're kicking off in 2024 across various therapeutic areas, including cancer, and we look forward to sharing the results of the study Sophia mentioned, Shock Surgeon Solutions, this spring, and bringing you up to speed on our value-based healthcare work. I think you're muted, Trevor. Do you hear him, Sophia?
No, I can't hear you, Trevor.
Sorry, sorry, Timothy had a fantastic question. Do you think that a potential national formulary would increase or decrease speed to public listing?
Good question.
Great question.
Well, maybe I'll, like I said earlier, there's a lot that can be done if we take a Team Canada approach. Look at the Atlantic provinces and what value could happen in that shared resource environment. And I think that is really a strategy that can actually benefit Canada. And I think that approach was taken when it came to the pandemic and access to the vaccine, or the vaccines rather. So yes, I think working together as a nation in a consolidated approach, respecting provincial health systems, and their respective ministries, there's a way that we can work together. Canada as a nation is, a smaller market than other international markets, and we could consolidate and be more collaborative that would increase access to these therapies sooner and reduce the inequities that our analysis shows.
Excellent. Yeah, I thought it was a fantastic question, and it's a very, very interesting one that we'll definitely look more into. That is all the time we have for questions for now. Thank you very much, Sophia and Chad, for that amazing presentation, and we definitely hope to hear from you in the future. So thank you very much for this. It was very eye-opening.
Our pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
This is one of a series of webinars that we are presenting this spring. In 2 weeks from now, we actually are going to be welcoming back Don Husero, who will be doing a presentation. So check your email for that next one coming up in a couple of weeks. If you're not getting our e-blast, you're not seeing our emails in your inbox, please make sure that you are registered. Sometimes Google and our third-party email service do not talk properly to each other. So it is good to go over to our website, survivornet.ca, and to click subscribe. And make sure that you are subscribed to our newsletter, because you will see everything that's going on, what we're doing in a lot of different things like our virtual action week, what we're doing in our webinar series, of course, and latest news and events from across the cancer community. All that can be seen at survivornet.ca. And if you want to check out more of our webinar series, you can go to survivornet.ca/webinar or go to our YouTube channel. And so with that, I hope everyone has a fantastic evening. We'll see you all on the next one. Have a good evening.